Chapter 10 of For the Temple, A Tale of the Fall of Jerusalem by G.A. Henty. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dory Smith. Chapter 10, Captives, Part 1. John was received with great joy by his father, who had already heard the story brought by the injured member of the band from Gamala, and was filled with pride that his son should so have distinguished himself. He at once agreed to John's proposal that he should start, on the following day, to fetch the women from Neve, as there was no longer any fear of trouble from the Romans. Galilee was completely subdued, and whatever events might take place in Judea, those in the north would be unaffected by them. The day after his return, then, John set out with Jonas for Neve. John charged his companion on no account to say anything of their doings at the siege of Gamala, and as communication was difficult, and they had not heard from Simon since John had left him, his friends at Neve were not aware that he had been absent from the farm. Martha and Mary were delighted to see him, and to hear that all was well at home. They had been greatly alarmed at the news of the slaughter of the fishermen on the lake, fearing that John might have gone across to Tarichea with some of his friends in the village. Their fears on his head, however, abated as time passed on, and they did not hear from Simon, who, they felt assured, would have brought the news to Martha had aught happened to their son. They had mourned over the siege and massacre of Gamala, and had been filled with joy when the news arrived, 3 days before, that the Roman army had marched away to take up its quarters for the winter, and they had looked for the summons which John brought for their return home. "And does your father think, John, that there will be trouble again this spring? Shall we have to leave home again as soon as the winter is past?" "He hopes not, mother. Gamala was the only town on this side of the Jordan that resisted the Roman authority, and, as all the territories of Agrippa are now peaceful, there is no reason why the Romans should enter these again. And indeed, all Galilee has now surrendered. As Vespasian moved towards the sea, deputies came to him from every town and village, and I think now that there will be no more trouble there." "It has been terrible enough, my son. What tens of thousands of men have perished, what destruction has been wrought! We have been mourning for months now for the woes which have fallen upon our people." "It has been most terrible, mother, and yet it might have been worse. Nigh 150,000 have fallen, at Gadara, Jotapata, Jaffa, Tarichea, and Gamala, besides those who were slain in the villages that had been sacked and destroyed. Still, considering all things, it might have been worse, and were it all over now, did no more dangers threaten our nation, we might even rejoice that no greater evils have befallen us for our revolt against Rome. But what has been done is but a preparation for the siege of Jerusalem. However, do not let us begin to mourn over the future. The storm has, for the present, passed away from us, and whatever misfortunes have befallen our countrymen, we have happily escaped. The farm stands uninjured, and no harm has come to any of us." "And all the villagers have escaped, John? Did none of our neighbors go out in their boats to Tarichea? We feared, when we heard of the sea fight, that some must have fallen." "No, mother. Fortunately, they listened to the counsels of my father, who implored them not to put out on the lake, for that, did they do so, they would only bring misfortune and ruin upon themselves." "And have you heard, John," Mary asked, "anything of the champion who they say has arisen? We have heard all sorts of tales of him, how he harassed the Romans before Gamala, and with his followers burned their camp one night and well nigh destroyed them, and how, when he goes into the fight, the Roman javelins drop off without harming him, and how, when he strikes, the Romans fall before his blows like wheat before a sickle." John burst into a laugh. "I wonder, Mary, that the reports didn't say also that he could fly through the air when he chose, could render himself invisible to the enemy, and could, by a wave of his hand, destroy them as the host of Sennacherib were destroyed." The Romans were harassed somewhat at Gamala by John and his followers, who crept into their camp at night and set it on fire, and had a few skirmishes with their working parties. But when you have said that, you have said all there is to say about it. "That's not like you, John," Mary said indignantly, for the tales that had circulated through the province had fired her imagination. "Everyone is talking of what he has done. He, alone of all our leaders, has checked the Romans, and has shown wisdom as well as valor in fighting. I should have thought you would have been one of the first to praise him. Everyone is talking about him, and since we heard of what he has been doing, Mother and I pray for him daily, as we pray for you and your father, and now you want to make out he has done nothing." "I do not want to make out that he has done nothing, Mary, for doubtless the Lord has been with him, and has enabled him to give some trouble to the Romans. But I was laughing at the fables you have heard about him, and at the reports which had converted his skirmishes with the Romans into all sorts of marvelous actions." "I believe they were marvelous actions," Mary said. "Why should what people say be all wrong?" "We believe in him, don't we, Mother?" "Yes, Mary, it is true that the tales we have heard may be, as John says, exaggerated. But assuredly this new champion of our people must be a man of wisdom and valor, and I see not why, as God raised up champions for Israel in the old time, he should not do so now when our need is so great." "There is no reason, Mother," John said more quietly. "But I fear that the champion of Israel is not yet forthcoming. We have heard of the doings of this John, and, as I said, he has merely had some skirmishes with the Romans, his band being too small to admit of any regular fighting. He interrupted their work and gave them some trouble, and his men, creeping down into the camp, set it on fire, and so caused them a good deal of loss. But more than this cannot be said of him." "At any rate," Mary said disdainfully, "he has done more than your Josephus, John, for he brought ruin on all who took his advice, and went into the cities he had fortified. It may please you to make little of what this champion has done. Others do not think so. Everywhere he is talked of, and praised. The old men are talking of him. The Jewish maidens are singing songs in his honor. I heard them yesterday, gathered round a well near Neve. His father must rejoice, and his mother be proud of him, if they are alive." "What do they say down by the lake, Jonas, of this captain? Are not the tales we have heard believed there?" "I have heard nothing about the Roman javelins not harming him," Jonas said, "but he certainly got safely out of the hands of the Romans when they had well nigh taken him, and all say that he is brave and prudent, and men have great confidence and trust in him." "Ridiculous, Jonas!" John exclaimed angrily, and Mary and his mother looked at him in surprise. "Truly, John," his mother said, "what Mary said is just. This is not like you. I should have thought you would have been one of the first to admire this new leader, seeing that he is fighting in the way I have heard you advocate as being that in which the Romans should be fought, instead of the Jews being shut up in the cities." "Quite so, Mother. No doubt he is adopting the proper way of fighting, and therefore has naturally had some success. I am only saying that he has done nothing wonderful, but has given the Romans some trouble by refusing to fight, and by merely trying to harass them. If there were 1,000 men who would gather small bands together and harass the Romans night and day in the same manner, they would render it well nigh impossible for them to make any progress. As it was, he merely aided in delaying the fall of Gamala by a day or two. And now let us talk of something else. Our father has succeeded in getting in the principal part of the harvest, but I fear that this year you will be short of fruit. We have had no time to gather in the figs, and they have all fallen from the trees, and although we have made enough wine for our own use, there will be but little to sell." "It matters not at all," Martha said. "God has been very merciful towards us, and so that we have but bread to eat and water to drink, until next harvest we shall have nothing to repine about, when ruin and destruction have fallen upon so many." That evening, when Mary and Martha had retired to their apartments, the former, who had been very silent all the evening, said, "I cannot understand, Mother, why John speaks so coldly of the doings of this brave leader, and why he was almost angry at our praises of him. It seems altogether unlike him." "It is unlike him, Mary, but you must never be surprised at men. They do not like to hear each other praised, and though I should have thought, from what I know of my son, that he was above the feeling of jealousy, I cannot but think that he showed some signs of that feeling today." "But it seems absurd, Mother. I can understand John being jealous of any one his own age who surpassed him in any exercises, though I never saw him so, for when rowing on the lake, or in shooting with bows and arrows, or in other sports, some of our neighbors' sons have surpassed him, he never seemed to mind at all, and it seems almost absurd to think that he could be jealous of a great leader who has done brave deeds for our people." "It does seem so, Mary, and I wonder myself. But it has been ever one of our national faults to be jealous of our leaders. From the time the people vexed Moses and Aaron in the wilderness, it has ever been the same. I grieve to see it in John, who has distinguished himself greatly for his age, and of whom we are proud. But no one is perfect, my child, and you must not trouble because you find that your betrothed husband is not free from all weaknesses." "I don't expect him to be free from all weaknesses, mother, but this is one of the last weaknesses I should have expected to find in him, and it troubles me. When everything seemed so dark, it was a pleasure to think that a hero, perhaps a deliverer, had arisen, and now John seems to say that he has done nothing." "My dear child," Martha said, "something may have occurred to vex John on the way, and when men are put out, they will often show it in the strangest manner. Probably John will, another time, speak just as warmly in praise of our new leader as you would yourself." "Perhaps it may be so, mother," Mary assented. "I can hardly believe that John is jealous. It does seem so unlike himself." "I would not speak on the subject again, Mary, if I were you, unless he himself brings it up. A wise woman keeps silence on subjects which may lead to disagreement. You will learn, when you have married, that this is the easiest and best way." "I suppose so, mother," Mary said in a tone of disappointment. "But somehow it never seemed to me before that John and I could have any subject on which there would be disagreement." "My dear Mary," Martha said, smiling, "John and you are both mortal, and although you may truly love each other, and will, I trust, be very happy as husband and wife, subjects will occur upon which you will differ, and then, as you know, the wisest plan is for the wife to be silent. It is the wife's duty always to give way to the husband." Mary gave a little shrug of her shoulders, as if to intimate that she did not regard altogether favorably this view of a wife's duties. However, she said no more, but kissed Martha and retired to bed. The next morning they started early and journeyed to Capitolius, where they stayed at the house of some friends. In the evening, the talk again turned upon the new leader who had burned the Roman camp. When they did so, John at once made some excuse and went out. He regretted now that he had not at once told his mother what he had been doing. He had intended, in the first place, to give her a little surprise, but had no idea of the exaggerated reports that had been spread about, and when Mary broke out into praise of the unknown leader, it seemed to him that it would have been absurd to say that he himself was the person of whom she had formed so fantastically exalted an opinion. Not having said so at first, he did not see how he could say so afterwards, and so left the matter as it stood until they should return home. While John was out, he heard news which caused him some uneasiness. It was said that parties of Roman horse from Cytopolis had been scouring the country, burning many villages, under the pretext that some Roman soldiers who had straggled away marauding on their own account had been killed by the peasants, slaughtering the people and carrying off as slaves such young women and men as were likely to fetch good prices. He told his mother what he had heard, and asked her whether she did not think that it would be better to stay where they were for a time or return to Neve. But Martha was anxious to be at home again, and the friend with whom they were stopping said that these reports were a week old, and that doubtless the Romans had returned to their camp. She determined, therefore, that she and Mary would continue their journey, but that the maids should remain with their friend at Capitolius until the Roman excursion ceased. They accordingly set out in the morning, as before, the two women riding and John and Jonas walking by the side of the donkeys. Following the road by the side of the Hieromax, they kept on without meeting anything to cause alarm, until they reached the angle of the stream, where the road to Hippos branched off from that which followed the river down to Tarichea. They had gone but a short distance when they saw a cloud of dust rising along the road in front of them and the sparkle of arms in the sun. "Turn aside, mother," John exclaimed. "Those must be the Romans ahead." Turning aside, they rode toward some gardens and orchards at no great distance, but before they reached them, two Roman soldiers separated themselves from the rest and galloped after them. "Fly, John," Martha said hurriedly. "You and Jonas can escape." "It would only ensure evil to you if we did, mother. No, we will keep together." The Roman soldiers rode up and roughly ordered the party to accompany them back to the main body, which consisted of 50 men. The leader, a young officer whose garments and armor showed that he belonged to a family of importance, rode forward a few paces to meet them. "Some more of this accursed race of rebels," he exclaimed. "We are quiet travelers," John said, "journeying from Capitolius to Tarichea. We have harmed no one, my lord." "You are all the same," the Roman said, scowling. "You speak to us fair one day and stab us in the back the next." "Pomponius," he said to a sergeant, "put these two lads with the rest. They ought to fetch a good price, for they are strong and active. As to the girl, I will make a present of her to the general to send to his wife in Rome. She is the prettiest Jewess I have seen since I entered the country. The old woman can go. She is of no use to anyone." Martha threw her arms around Mary and would have striven to resist, with her feeble strength, the carrying out of the order, when John said in Hebrew, "Mother, you will ruin us all and lose your own life. Go home quietly and trust me to save Mary." The habit of submitting to her husband's will, which Martha had practiced all her life, asserted itself. She embraced Mary passionately, and drew aside as the Roman soldiers approached, and then, tottering away a short distance, sank weeping on the ground. Mary shed no tear, but, pale as death, walked by the side of a soldier who led her to the rear of the cavalcade, where 4 or 5 other young women were standing in dejected attitudes. John and Jonas were similarly placed, with some young men, in the midst of the Roman soldiers. Their hands were tied behind them, and the troop resumed its way. They were traveling by the road along which the little party had just come. Whenever a house or small village was seen, half of the troop galloped off. Flames were soon seen to rise, and parties of wretched captives were driven in. When about halfway to Capitolius, the troop halted. The horses were turned into a field of ripe corn to feed. Half the men sat down to a meal, while the remainder stood on guard over the captives. John had whispered to Jonas to work his hands so as to loosen his cords, if possible, and the lad, whose bones were very small, soon said that he could slip the ropes off without difficulty. It was harder work for John, and indeed, while on the march he did not venture to exert himself, fearing that the movements would be noticed by his guards. But when they halted, he got into the middle of the group of captives and tried his best to loosen his cords. Jonah was close beside him. "It is of no use, Jonas," he said. "The cords are cutting into my flesh, and they will not yield in the slightest. Let me try, John." "Stand round close," Jonas said to the other captives in Hebrew. "I want to loosen my friend's knots. If he can get away, he will bring rescue to you all." The others moved so as to completely cover the movements of Jonas, and the lad, stooping down, applied his teeth to the knot in John's cords, and soon succeeded in loosening it. "That will be enough, Jonas. I can draw my hands through now." Jonas stood up again. "When I make an effort to escape, Jonas, do you dash between the horsemen and run for it. In the confusion you will get a start, and they will not overtake you until you are across the river. Once on the hill you are safe. If you remain behind and I get away, as likely as not one of the soldiers would send a javelin through you as being my companion." After half an hour's halt, the Romans again mounted their horses and turned to retrace their steps. 2 Romans rode on either side of the captives, who were about 50 in number, and John gradually made his way to the front of the party, between the 2 leading horsemen. The officer, talking to his sergeant, rode a few paces ahead in the middle of the road. Since the cords had been loosened, John had continued to work his fingers until the circulation was restored. Suddenly he slipped his hands from their fastenings, gave 3 bounds forward, and vaulted onto the back of the horse behind the officer. He had drawn the knife which had been hidden in his girdle, and he threw one arm around the officer, while he struck the knife deep into the horse's flank. The animal reared in the air, and then, at a second application of the knife, sprang forward at the top of his speed, before the astonished Roman knew what had happened. John held him in his arms like a vice, and, exerting all his strength, lifted him from the saddle and hurled him headlong to the ground, where he lay bleeding and insensible. John now had time to look around. Struck with astonishment at the sudden incident which had passed under their eyes, the Romans had at first instinctively reined in their horses. The sergeant had been the first to recover himself, and, shouting to the 5 leading soldiers on each side to follow him, had spurred in pursuit, just as his officer was hurled to the ground. But John was already some 50 yards away, and felt sure that he could not be overtaken. He had remarked the horse ridden by the officer while they were eating, and saw that it was of far higher blood and swifter pace than any of those ridden by the soldiers. His own weight, too, was far less than that of the heavy-armed men in pursuit of him, and, with a shout of scornful defiance and a wave of his hand, he continued his course. Before a mile had been passed, he had left his pursuers far in the rear, and, seeing the hopelessness of the pursuit, they presently reined up and returned to the main body. Jonas had carried out John's instructions, and the instant the latter sprang on the officer, he slipped under the belly of the horse next to him and ran, at the top of his speed, for the river. It was but 100 yards away, and he had gone 3/4 the distance before any of the soldiers, confused at the attack upon their officer, doubtful whether the whole of the captives were not about to fall upon them, and without orders how to act, set out in pursuit. Jonas plunged into the stream, dived to the other side, and then sprang forward again, just as 3 or 4 soldiers reached the bank he had left. Their javelins were hurled after him, but without effect, and, with a shout of triumph, he sprang up the hillside and was soon safe from pursuit. As soon as he saw that the Romans had turned back, John sprang from his horse, unstrapped the heavy armor which covered its chest and sides, and flung it away, and then, mounting, resumed his course. At the first house he came to, he borrowed a shepherd's horn, and as he approached the first village, sounded his signal for the assembly. 2 or 3 young men ran out from their houses as he dashed up, for there was not a village in those parts from which some of the young men had not gone up to the mountains to join him, after the fall of Gamala, and all were ready to follow him anywhere. He rapidly gave them orders to go to all the villages round, and instruct the young men to assemble, with all speed possible, at their old trysting place near Jabez Gilead, and to spread the news as they went, some from each village being sent as messengers to others. Then he pursued his way at full speed, and by sunset had issued his orders in some 20 villages. Being convinced that by night a sufficient number of men would have gathered in the mountain for his purpose, he rode back to the river, swam his horse across, and then, leaving it to shift for itself, made his way up the mountain. Some 70 or 80 men had already arrived at the appointed place, and fresh parties were coming in every minute. Jonas was already there, John having arranged with him to watch the movements of the Romans until the sun set, and then to bring word to the place of meeting as to their movements. "Well, Jonas, what is your news?" "The Romans have halted for the night at a spot about a mile this side of where we left them. They remained where they were until the party who had ridden after you returned. Then they went slowly back, after having made a litter with their spears, on which 4 of them carried the officer you threw from his horse. What a crash he made! I heard the clang of his arms as I was running. They stopped near one of the villages they burned as we went past, and when I turned to make my way here their fires were burning, so there's no doubt they mean to halt there for the night." "That is good news indeed," John said. "Before morning we will rouse them up in a way they little expect." John's followers arrived eager for the fight, for the news of the devastations committed by this party of Romans had roused the whole district to fury. As a rule, the Romans, except when actually on campaign, abstained from all ill treatment of the inhabitants, the orders against plundering and injuring the people being here, as in other countries held by the Roman arms, very stringent. In the present case there was no doubt that Roman soldiers had been killed, but these had brought their fate upon themselves by their ill treatment and insult of the villagers, and no notice would have been taken of the slaying of men while acting in disobedience of orders, had it not been that they belonged to the company of Servilius Maro. He was a young noble, possessed of great influence in Rome, and of a ferocious and cruel disposition, and he had urged the general so strongly to allow him to go out to inflict punishment upon the country people that consent had reluctantly been given. But even at this time, although the Jews were not aware of it, a messenger was on his way to Servilius with peremptory orders to him to return at once to Sitopolis, as most serious reports as to his cruelty to peaceful inhabitants had come to the general's ears. But that message Servilius was never to receive. By midnight, upwards of 400 men had gathered at the rendezvous in the mountains. John divided the force into 4 bodies, and gave each their orders as to the part that they were to take, and then marched down the hill, crossed the river, and advanced toward the Roman bivouac. When within a quarter of the mile of the fires, the band broke up into sections and proceeded to surround the enemy. When each company had reached the position John had marked out for it, the men began to crawl slowly forward towards the Romans. John sounded a note on his horn, and, with a shout, the whole band rushed to their feet and charged down upon the enemy. Before the latter could spring to their feet and mount their horses, the Jews were among them. John, with a picked band of 20 men, at once made his way to the center of the camp, where the captives, ignorant of the cause of this sudden alarm, stood huddled together. Placing his men around him, to prevent any Roman soldier injuring them, John joined in the fray. It was short. Taken by surprise, unable to get together and form in order of defense, the Roman soldiers were surrounded and cut down, each man fighting stubbornly to the last. One of the first to fall was their leader, who, springing to his feet at the alarm, had rushed just as he was, without helmet or armor, among his soldiers, and was stabbed in a dozen places before he had time to draw his sword. The moment the conflict was over, and the last Roman had fallen, John ordered his men to disperse at once. "Regain your homes before morning," he said. "There may be other parties of Romans out, and it is well that none, even of your friends, should see you return, and then the Romans will have no clue as to those who have taken part in this night's business. Take not any of their arms or spoils. We have fought for vengeance, and to relieve our friends, not for plunder. It is well that the Romans should see that, when they hear of the disaster and march out to bury the dead." The men were already crowding around the captives, relieving them from their bonds, and, in many cases, embracing and weeping on their necks, for among them were many friends and relations of the rescuing party. John soon found Mary. End of Chapter 10, Part 1. Recording by Dory Smith.